Everybody. I'm Kristen Johnson, Local Arts Advancement Program Manager.
Good morning. I am Jarrell Jenkins, Local Arts Services Coordinator, and welcome to day 2 of this conference.
Shout out. Woo! It's our pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote, and let me tell you, you're going to be blown away. Jeffrey L. Bowman is the co-founder and CEO of Reframe, an early-stage software and services company that helps teams and businesses accelerate change and growth for the new workplace and marketplace. He will share his award-winning insights, best practices, and blueprint for how to accelerate growth with the new majority marketplace while increasing employee retention, productivity, and engagement.
Jeffrey is also a Wiley published author of Reframe the Marketplace, the Total Market Approach to the New Majority, and a white paper, Leadership, Marketing, and the New Majority. Other published works include the Cross-Cultural Report, the Brand Cross-Cultural Index, the State of the Total Market Industry Vertical, How to Assess Your Organization's Cultural Maturity, Reframe Workplace Change Guide, and Reframe Marketplace Change Guide. Please welcome to the stage, Jeffrey L. Bowman.
If I had to talk to brands about the new majority marketplace, I would tell them to stop being lazy and short-sighted.
Right now, brands are at a crossroads. If they don't embrace the learning required in this new age of cross-culturalism, they'll fade. People today are culturally mixed, gender neutral, and more often than not, don't identify with only one race, one ethnicity, or one box. It's time for brands to evolve and wake up.
Brands have an opportunity to view diversity and inclusion differently. For so many brands, it's just been about checking off boxes. So we got our Asians, we got our gays, we got our blacks, we got our Latinos.
Multicultural consumers are mainstream. They're influencing America.
Commercials, radio, TV, print need to be reflective of what people see in terms of the general society, and it's not a one-size-fits-all application.
The traditional model of consumer understanding was based on generalities, and when you start looking at millennials, the cross-cultural nature of them is much deeper. It starts with lifestyle and values.
We've really had to go beyond language that really kind of makes up culture, whether it be passion points related to food, music, fashion, art.
Diverse casting isn't going to get it.
For many brands, it's as simple as Latinos and blacks are going to be the new majority, but those groups are still monolithic themselves. I mean, as an African-American man who lives in the Baltimore, D.C. area, I have more in common with an Asian guy in San Francisco and a Latino in New York than I do oftentimes another African-American in Birmingham, Alabama.
Like Miami, very Latin, but when you take the Hispanic population in Los Angeles, it's much more Mexican. So you have to know those nuances on the ground level.
We're all kind of intercultural, and whites are in the game too.
The person on the other end, no matter what screen they're looking on, that you get that head nod, they can say, they get me.
Being American will not only be anchored in racial or ethnic experiences, but more so shared aspirations. This is the age of acceleration. The urgency to adapt to it has never been more stark. It needs to be embraced with understanding and effective communications. More than $3 trillion and 50 years of future buying power is up for grabs.
Good morning. Before I get started, I want to thank American for the Arts, Ruby and team. You guys have been amazing. We've been working together now for at least a month or so. But really want to appreciate everybody for getting out of bed, coming this morning. But we're going to go on a little journey. We've got about maybe 50 minutes to spend together. And rather than this I speak to you guys, I want you guys to speak to me as well. But we're going to have a little master class. And I'm going to talk about some things that you guys may not be familiar with regards to the terminology. You're more than welcome to use the references here. Like, what did he say? That doesn't sound right. Because we're going to cover a lot of range, and it's mostly going to be about American history. and the intersectionality of how culture, race, and identity plays into it. But we're gonna frame it up in the context of business. You guys with me? So, we're gonna talk a little bit about Reframe so that everybody can get grounded. But we're also gonna talk a little bit about what is this new topic called total market. It was a new term that I had to do the research on and understand the context of total market. And so when we talk about total market, we're gonna talk about the total addressable audience. The second thing, we're gonna talk about the opportunity that you have as marketers within the arts and culture space, within your location, or domain. And then we're gonna just quickly go through their approach as to how it can work for your organization in your city, town. And then the last piece, we're gonna use a case study that we were able to provide for you guys for a local arts agency. Bring it home in terms of how you can walk away with something that you can use immediately. And then hopefully, after we cover this, you guys won't be too tired of me. We'll talk about a new product that we're gonna introduce in 2020 that allows organizations and companies to scale this new approach for the entire city, county, municipality. All right? So we're gonna cover lots. Raise your hand if you say, hey, hold up, you're going too quick. Pull back. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because we want to try and make this as interactive as possible. I wanted to start with this guy. How many people know who this guy is? Yeah? There's a race here, a NASCAR race. His name is Richard Petty. And in the summer of 1990, I was recruited to Pepsi to intern for Pepsi of Knoxville, Tennessee. Why is that important? I was 19, looking at how am I gonna pursue my career, and Pepsi had this diversity and inclusion, at that time there was no inclusion, it was primarily diversity, initiative where they were gonna develop the next pipeline of leaders. Why was that important for Pepsi is because they had just acquired what they call franchise-owned organizations, FOBO, franchise bottling organizations. So what does that mean? These guys were family-owned businesses. Corporate Pepsi had acquired them, and for the first time, they were going to recruit, acquire managers and people of color. This was in 1989. So I would call that Generation 2 post-civil rights. Generation 2. Generation 1 was integration, and then Generation 2 were the kids of the parents who had just basically gone through the integration movement. And so when I was out in the field on a truck, driving up the mountains to basically drop shoulders off, I had to stick up these signs. And at that particular moment, in the mountains, you had people that had never come down the mountain since the Vietnam War. And so I walked in the store, and the guy looks at the route driver and says, hey, he's not coming into my store. I was like, oh my gosh, clutch of pearls. Why not? I didn't get it. And that was because of racism. And so from that moment, I had to get in, stand on the outside of that store, because I was used to just sticking up the signs, building a case, and then leave. But he excluded me because of my color. For the first time, I was 19. So as I rode back down the mountain, I had to report to HR what had just happened. And then HR talked to me and told me about the environment that I was in. I was in shock. But that was diversity initiative, bringing people into an organization where the people within the organization truly hadn't been trained as to how to integrate people coming into the organization that didn't act, think, or look like them. And I said to myself, if I ever got a chance to change the practice of diversity and inclusion, eventually became the practice of multicultural marketing, I would. And I got that opportunity in 2010. So after Pepsi, I went to P&G, I sat across the table. I saw these guys come in with these portfolios. I said, oh my gosh, what are you guys gonna do? We're gonna talk about pretty pictures. You guys get to do that? Word? And so that got me more interested in terms of brand management, commercials. But then after P&G, it was Miller, then Whirlpool, then Dell, and then Sears. And the one thing that was consistent is that these categories of diversity and inclusion changed, morphed, and as I grew up in the corporate structure, I went from someone belonging to an ERG to someone leading an employee resource group. And then when I made budget decisions in terms of how to spend those dollars for advertising communications that had the greatest intent of attracting and acquiring audiences that were of color, typically that was called multicultural marketing. So I get the call from Ogilvy. Ogilvy had a group called Ogilvy Consulting. And by then, 25 years had passed. I know I look young, right? And I got the call, and they said, hey, we want you to come to Ogilvy Consulting. The world is changing, digital is coming, and we really want you to help us understand how to be more effective in our communications, because social media was really starting to take off. And by that time, you think about it, 1960 census, less than 10% of the population of color. By 1980, you had right around 30% of the population that was of color. And so for companies, they had to really start to think about this thing. So came into Ogilvy, 2 years, got indoctrined. And then the president of Ogilvy came to me and said, hey, Jeff, we really like what you're doing. You're bringing a lot of great consulting skills, but we got a question for you. If David Ogilvy were here and he wanted to start an agency in 2050, what would that agency look like? I said, oh man, I got it. It's my opportunity to change something that I experienced in 1989. But I didn't know that, right? Because it was like David Ogilvy is the godfather of advertising. How do you change the industry from there? So we started a group called Ogilvy Culture. And I'm gonna get into the framework of how this affects you guys as it relates to marketing communications. Within advertising and marketing, it is a $600 billion category. That's B. Every day you guys walk into your office, people talk about audience development, your cities are changing, and we need to do more in terms of getting audiences into the theater, getting audiences into different venues. But you guys are making decisions every day as to how to invest and how to spend, either for what we call a general market audience or a multicultural audience. How many tracking with me? Y'all tracking? All right. So, what does that sound like? 1960s, right? But every single day you make choices with your dollars. How you hire, how you spend your dollars, and how you attract and engage different audiences. So we started Ogilvy Culture as a third option, as a total market industry vertical agency that provides cross-cultural insights. Right? How many people have heard of cross-cultural? A few? Yeah? So we're gonna get into that. So again, the world from the time they started doing the print ad, the written text, all the way to where videos are today, we're structured for general market multicultural. We started the industry's first cross-cultural agency, and then voila, we got some news. I called home to mom, I said, I made it, the New York Times. But little did we know what was in front of us. And what we meant by that is that America was in a very different place at that particular time. And the president, CEO was feeling very post-racial. It's like, we've got to change this structure. It's not right, Jeff. Can you help us do this? we were in a different place. The census comes out 2010, amazing in terms of growth. From 1960 census to 2010, we go from less than 10% to approaching 40 in some places. We are already at minority majority. We're ready. We picked up some business, we launched it. We went from $0 to $7 million in a matter of 24 months. Evidence done. Everybody's gonna adopt our approach. We're gonna move away from general market, multicultural, to total market. Didn't happen. And part of it is because in the underpinnings of the US, you still had two Americas. Chicago, there's a piece written in the New York Times that talked about if you've ever been to Chicago, there's the south side and the west side, and then there's the north side. So even though we had all this great energy happening, we're still two Americas, still voting for dollars with regards to general market and multicultural. So we really had just started to crack the very underpinnings with the agency being the total market shop, cross-cultural insights. Now, flash forward, the thing that kept us going at Ogilvy Culture were the numbers. You can't argue against this. And what I mean by that, within the marketplace, meaning consumers, predicted by 2040, minorities, meaning Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and women, were going to become the majority population. But what quickly happened was that all babies born from this day forward are going to be minority majority. And then when we started to go into some of these companies, the HR people would kind of jump over to the marketing people. It's like, hey, what are y'all doing over there? And then they'd come and I'd be walking to the restroom after workshops and say, hey, I'm such and such, I'm Chief Talent Officer. I want to talk to you. I was like, you don't do marketing. Why am I talking to you? And they says, well, what you're talking about is already happening in the workplace. You don't have to wait to 2040. You guys can do it right now. Everything you're talking about is gonna happen. You can start today. I was like, whoa, that's amazing. And so we began to take a look at the workplace. Because what we started to see was that because you had the structure of general market and multicultural, it required a new type of practice, and it was called change management. So all the marketing people come to me and say, hey, we want to do this thing, it's hot, it'll get me promoted, we're going to grow share, we're going to get audiences. Yeah, but you're still going to contract that out to someone who does multicultural marketing, or the Black person or Hispanic person will become that multicultural head, even though they've never done multicultural marketing. But will you begin to own it yourself and scale and make it sustainable? Because guess what? The people ain't changing. Pipes, meaning channels, social media will change, but the people using these things are going to continue to change and grow. So we're headed for the new majority. So there's a book that was written, Brown is the New White. And sometimes I would be a little uncomfortable saying that when I would go into these corporate rooms. I'd be the only Black person in the room. It's like, I don't know if I could lead with that. And he wrote the book because it was really about how do you get America to see this new majority in a very non-threatening way? How do you get them to understand? For 8,000 people born on a daily basis, 7,200 of those people are going to be of color. Sink in. Did you hear me? 90%. So, with that case, you need something different. You can't use the same practices that were developed in the 60s and 50s to address a very dynamic human problem. And by the way, it's not just the US, it's global. For what once referred as minorities in the US will become the majority, but globally, there's women, there's the middle class, there's youth, religion, in terms of Muslims. So this is a phenomenon Yes, there's global climate change, but there's human change that's happening as well. So there was no operating system. We scratched the surface at Ogilvy with the idea of cross-culturalism. And while we were doing that, having fun doing that, there was a bigger challenge ahead. So I left Ogilvy in 2015 to start Reframe. And partly because I wanted to move faster and quicker. Like I didn't want my kids talking about this in another 50 years. If we all do what we're supposed to do, this will not be something to talk about in 50 years. So I started Reframe, and think of us as like the McKinsey of Culture. Everybody knows what McKinsey is, change management. They come in there with the big decks and binders, and they help the CEO make change, sustainable change. And so the reason for that is because, yes, we can help you with the marketing, we can help you with employee retention, but it's an operating system where everyone learns how to do this. Because if not, you're going to be in a very difficult position. Other people that will start to do this will do it better, quicker, faster, and all of a sudden have a better business trapped than you. And so we built an ecosystem. Yes, there is a book, there is publishing, because what we wanted to do was make this something that is historical, memorialize it, so that generations ahead could use this approach and process. So it took us literally 10 years to develop everything that we're going to talk about today. And part of that's because I didn't want another kid being told to stand outside because someone felt a different way about that person. And so with this ecosystem, it allows you to learn, you to make mistakes, but also rethink or reframe your approach for going to market, but for also bringing people into the company. I've been to a couple of these things in terms of not conferences, but local arts agencies, and they say, well, we want to really reinvent our model for how do we drive audience. I said, well, what's your reinvention model for your internal organization? Did you hear me? Because this isn't temporary. The second thing is that all the people that you used to go to for employee giving, well, look at that chart. It's a new audience in the workplace. So what you do on the outside needs to be consistent with what you do on the inside. It's direct correlation. And I even took that for granted until the chief talent officer started tugging on me. It's like, I don't do HR, man. I make money. But to drive sustainable change, it can't just be from the outside in, it has to be from the inside out. You guys tracking with me? So we went to all these companies, they said, please hire us, we got something really hot. And they hired us in 2015. From 2015 to 2018, we were experimenting, testing, learning, validating their approach for both marketplace change and workplace change. In 2020, we'll introduce software, because I don't want to be doing this for 30 years. I want to scale it so that everybody really gets with it to reflect the future of work and the future of marketplace. So that's the background. Tracking with me? Yes? So let's talk about this topic. Why is this topic important? And why we call ourselves the McKinsey of Culture? So imagine, it's the 1960s. It's a lot going on. You got the war. Blacks are coming out to South, they're migrating to the North. Blacks are getting educated. Some people are upset. Malcolm, Martin. It's a really tough time in the 60s. So the CEOs turned to McKinsey. This is, you really got to help us out here. The blacks are moving up. They're getting more educated. They're going to become a part of this middle class. And we really have to understand, how do we talk to them? How do we get them into our organizations so that we can be good corporate citizens? So McKinsey wrote this white paper. Now, background, members, I was at Ogilvy, I got the question and said, hey, if David Ogilvy were here, how would the agency look? So I had to go all the way back to the 1940s, the 1950s, think Mad Men time frame, if you've ever seen that. And the beauty about this is that I had an ERG partners, right? I said I'd been working with the chief diversity officer, chief talent officer at Ogilvy, so we had a group. They were ready, they were woke before there was woke. And they were all like fresh out of undergrad. They were telling me, I'm not African American, I'm black. I'm like, what? And so it was a lot of education, so we use that internal structure to more or less do this type of research. Because there was the ambition of wanting to change, but in order to do that, we had to make the business case internally with the executive leadership team. So we found this white paper, and I said, wow, I think we found a needle in a haystack. We got something here. So McKinsey wrote this paper about the changing face of marketing. Sounds familiar? It was 1966. Crazy, right? But I said, man, we got a gem here. We got it. And it says typically a total market now comprises of a series of submarkets, right, for the first time, each with its own characteristics and each demanding a different sales approach. Because think about it, at that particular time, there was not a lot of marketing, they were not savvy, you had to punch cards, you didn't even have computers at that particular time. So a lot of emphasis around sales, developing sales teams that were, black sales teams. So a lot of the things that you see today in terms of marketing and segments, McKinsey wrote this paper, I said, it's a total market. And now, flash forward to 2010 at the time, there's addressable data that we can now get to the underpinnings of the statement. So when I talk about total market, talk about the origins of hence what CEOs were wanting to do. Now, at that particular time, we were post-World War II, obviously. We were heading into another war, or in a war, with Vietnam. People were still producing things en masse. So this idea of general market agency, because you had ethnic, you didn't have multicultural at that particular time, was to serve the mass consumer from a general insights perspective. Why does that matter? Because everything was designed from marketing research to agencies to products for the mass white population. And it made sense at that particular time. Less than 10% of the population was of color. So your market, you got to make a budget, or you got to go with the 90% or the 10%? 90, right? So what I wanted to do in this next session is kind of talk a little bit about what was happening in your world. Surprise! And so this is Richard Hamilton piece. And I wanted to set up the context of what was happening from a commercial standpoint relative to the art piece, because this was a type of art known as popular art. Very different at that particular time, because what we were trying to do on the commercial side was produce everything that looked like the same thing for the most amount of people. But this type of art, he brought reflection in terms of these new things coming into our homes. How many people are familiar with Warhol? Right? Wrong audience for this, right? Sorry. That was a joke. Now, he was the one that actually developed this movement. So you look at what was happening, mass scale, the idea of looking the same, coming into your homes. For the first time, consumerism was a thing because of this little black box in the floor. You were moving away from the radio. So it was general. Meanwhile, things were happening socially that were extremely disruptive. And so when total market was introduced, CEOs was like, we're gonna shelve this thing. It's amazing, looks great. But we're really gonna go hyper segment, focus on the ethnic segment. And it was the right call at that particular time. Now, flash forward to the 80s, from a marketing communications perspective, things were happening in a little bit more segmented way. By that time, it was the glory days within ethnic marketing because African Americans, Black agencies were really getting the lion's share of the budget from companies, but you still, from an art perspective, had these things happening and stories were being told. Stories are being told through art that wasn't necessarily being told from a commercial perspective. And this was the case in New York. Michael Jean-Baptiste, where he told the story of police brutality of a friend of his. So art, with the intersection of commercialism, will really begin to talk about things before they were happening. And this is a friend I have in New York. He's Derek Fourjour. And I saw Derek's career take off from an art perspective because of the stories that he told that was happening on campus. Black stories. If you look at Beyonce, if you look at a lot of the kids today who are unapologetically Black, but also knows about other cultures, Derek does a good job of bringing you into the story. There's a mural that was produced at the Whitney, and he told the story. If you think about Beyonce and what she did with Coachella, a lot of influences that are being at the underpinnings that are not necessarily being told at the commercial side. And obviously this is a piece here that was produced and demonstrated in Atlanta. How many people know who these guys are? Right? I can pretty much guarantee you they didn't get funding from you guys, right? And I do this because if you look at the way that things have changed as relates to art, very centralized, top-down versus bottoms-up, all of that is being driven by this new majority. So if you're not thinking about your models of how do you flip it, they're gonna do it themselves. And I intentionally put Instagram on here. Notice at the very beginning, you walk, you look, you gotta be invited. We're here, it's for consumption. And it was everywhere. So, the last thing that's happening in your world is technology. And so, if you're thinking about change, it's no longer just change within your organization. It's change in terms of how you scale it, how to use the right approach, and how do you make it sustainable. I love the fact you guys are doing a great job. I went to a couple of sessions, you're talking about it. But what about how do we change versus the what? So, as you think about the transition, as you think about how do you make the change, you think about behaviors and attitudes, moving away from only focus on race or identity, but attitudes and behaviors. That's when you begin to see the scale piece to everything you're doing. Most people start what we call focus hyperly on race and identity, but then over time, because you've got the addressable data, you can begin to see what attitudes and behaviors that you're changing. Why is that important? That's what art does. If I see something that inspires me, it helps me change my attitudes and behaviors, irrespective of race or identity. So you're in that business, but how do you do it from an organizational perspective so that you match what you already do from an outcome perspective? All right? Tracking? All right, opportunity. So in 2010, one thing that we had to do, because as we figured out at Ogilvy, and I'm gonna go back and forth because there's a lot of intersection here, we had to write about this new industry. Right? So we went from general market to multicultural to total market. And you can only imagine what I got told, asked by poking the bear. Right? Why was that important? Because we got to this insight. New problem statement. And what I mean by that, typically if you went into organizations or you went out to market, they would say we can't get enough people into the company, or we can't reach this audience. So we then said, well, is that really the problem? Like, why is the workplace so behind the marketplace? So when we did the study, we went back to attitudes and behaviors. And within the world of social science, there are 5 stages of culture: mono, multi, cross, poly, and trans. 5. And so we said the workplace is 2 to 3 generations behind or removed from the marketplace. So we have all this tension in the US because we're trying to understand, how do we move from mono and multi to cross and poly? And because of that tension, the workplace, easiest KPI, when you look in the workplace, if everybody looks the same, they're typically a monocultural workplace. So how do you catch up? And so we restated the problem, or modernized the problem statement. Because when I go in, yes, we know there's a racial identity crisis in most cases, but we've been talking about this problem for a long time. So how do we now modernize it in such a way to where we really can address it and solve for it? So people ask me, what's the problem? Says, the workplace is 2 to 3 generations removed from the marketplace. And then I get back to the science piece of the problem. Like, how do you shift attitudes and behaviors in a very approachable? It doesn't let people off the hook, but it does give you new language to learn from. And so as we move forward in a continuum, there's this book called Thank You for Being Late. It talks about the age of acceleration. And what I mean by that, computers, bits, bytes, AI, they're moving at an exponential rate. So in order for organizations to catch up to that, you have to put the problem statement in the macro event, and that's accelerating. Things are changing. You don't have a year to plan. You've got months to plan. You don't have 2-3 years to go do that initiative, because people are creating startups. They are doing certain things in a very transparent way, because now you have technology to be that great equalizer and stabilizer. Remember the public art in Atlanta? No permission was asked other than the guy that took the photo. Right? Fast. Boom. Goes viral. So in your organizations, you have to think about, how do you sustain within this whole age of acceleration? No longer is this acceptable, meaning when you are practicing marketing and communications, typically today, you're either a general market or multicultural. $600 billion category. You look at monocultural attitudes and behaviors, meaning when someone says to you, well, we've had a hard time getting audiences to this particular venue, and we continue to get the same donors and patrons that we've always had. You're monocultural, right? Attitudes and behaviors, very efficient because you got the same database, you don't have to acquire them and pay more money and bring them in, pretty repeatable, but it lacks the ability to adapt. Programming kind of the same every year, which is cool, but then there's another audience, multicultural, that does the same thing, but maybe in a different venue. If I go talk to them, they're saying, we get great participation, but we just wish more white people would come to our events. So that's kind of the same issue, right? Both audiences are experiencing the same thing, and everybody wants to grow and be around and do great work to inspire attitudes and behaviors, right? You're in this business on the outcome. So with total market, it's cross-cultural and polycultural attitudes and behaviors, much more efficient and effective, and a little disruptive. But what it does do and where it starts is help you from an organizational perspective. Now, if you think about the 60s, when these models were created because America was shifting and changing from 10% of color to now, near approaching 50, all of the horizontal practices for most companies, so it's not just applicable to you guys, were created in the same way. Meaning if you had a donor giving, if you had grants and services, in most cases, you had two people doing two different things for these two different audiences. So, what's the difference? Our approach is modern, change approach. It's not grounded in the era of civil rights. It's not compliance-based. Yes, it is diverse and inclusive, but it's about maturity from a cultural perspective. Yes, it is racial identity, but it is about attitudes and behaviors from a cross-cultural and polycultural. Most of the time, if you're doing the other side, you got to get them in, but because you haven't done the right stuff to sustain it, you're likely to lose them over time. Ethnic focus, communities. When technology companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter first started, they were collecting massive amounts of data that did not include race or identity. But they had to go back to it because the advertisers like, whoa, we gotta protect, these dollars, $600 billion. And all of a sudden they had to restructure their sales organization and create a multicultural division within these companies. Because it's total addressable data that they were collecting. If you think Amazon, that's polycultural. I don't need to know who you are, your gender, your race identity, because you show me who you are by the click. So that's polyculture. Most companies are not there because they don't have the technology from an addressability standpoint. So, tracking with me, we're gonna go to the approach. Following? Yes? Outstanding. So, when we were thinking about this approach, we wanted to take a lot of the best practices from a consulting perspective with regards, because these are spaces and places that people hire to make the change that is sustainable for not only today, but forever and ever. And so we developed a 6-step process to drive integrated marketplace. And I'm not gonna talk about our workplace process with you guys because you guys are all marketers, right? You are not HR, but you kinda are, right? To accompany this operating system, there's software and services that we have it as well. Now, who's in the room? So when we go into local arts agency, I'm talking to the VP of marketing in most cases. The executive director's running around trying to pull out fires. So then we say, you're the captain, but you got to be the change agent. You're gonna go across the organization. And they're gonna ask you crazy, they're gonna look at you crazy because you're like audience development, bringing in people. But you're gonna have to ask them about what they do every day. And then they invite other people. The insights, grants, philanthropy, and they're like, why am I here? I don't wanna be here. So we do the kickoff meeting, and then they bring in their cultural partners, right? And the cultural partner's like, I just want my money. From last year to this year, don't mess it up. Then I'm gonna go out and compete against you, right? So, those are the people that need to be in the room. And the first thing that we do is we get organizational alignment. Now, within that organizational alignment, it critically is important because before we do the marketing piece, you have to shift the thinking with regards to resources and structure. So that's why that's critically important. So we're gonna walk you through each of the steps, but we're only gonna do the first one, which is really about what we call the landscape analysis or the assessment. And here's the case study. And the object is visual. Unfortunately, because of the work that we do, we can't say who the agency is. But they were looking for a way of transformation. Sounds familiar? They wanted growth, but when we looked at the demographics, the growth was happening in the east to west. And most of the institutions, cultural institutions, were centered. They were downtown, and you had to go up, you had to park, you had to get out of your car, you had to pay for parking, and then walk in to see culture. Cultural institutions and funding model were changing. So they asked us to come in, and what we do is what we call impact ambition, to really understand what type of impact that you want to make, and how you're going to do that, and then how does that affect your go-to-market approach as a whole. These are the things that we did in terms of getting to what we call those 6 C's. Those 6 C's are based on things that most companies' barriers face. And here's the first one. And these are just a takeaway. So this is like a sample. And so we would spend about a month doing interviews with folks across who's in the room. And then we have an impact day. So we invite those people back and we tell them the findings. And man, is it fun, right? Because in most cases, everybody kind of knows what the issues are. Everybody's gonna tell you. And typically after 6 interviews, I become a therapist, right? It's like Tuesdays with Jeff on the couch. And they come in, they forget who they're talking to, and they just let me have it, right? So, for the company piece, this is an example of an output. We say there's an old and new city. The local arts agency funding model no longer is competitive. And for the most part, even though you're in the inspiration business with regards to the arts, you're not inspired because there's no North Star. Right? Yes. This is how I become the therapist. Right? So, the third thing is that in most cases, companies, people know your brand, but not really. Because you fund other organizations, right? So it's an insiders club. And in most cases, the agencies was formed in a very monocultural workplace, right? So the cities change, but your model hasn't changed, primarily based on a monocultural model, right? So people of color engage in the planning process, but not really. There's a lack of both ethnic and cross-cultural insights. So we say modernize or die, because people are doing it bottoms up. Remember, you guys established your budgets on a very different model. These guys are doing the public art, IG, right? Different. So, category. In most cases, what we see, there's no ecosystem that exists. So people are organizing, sometimes without you guys, but really there's an opportunity for you guys to create an ecosystem versus just being a funder for the creative economy, which is happening. So it's a little bit of a different approach, a modern approach, as to how you reflect what's happening. And then the thing, you remember the old and new? Like, if you build this thing, in terms of this ecosystem, the residents stay longer, they're likely to give more, and that increases resident lifetime value. And so what we say, build a creative ecosystem. The next one, and I'll go straight. Partners compete against you guys, for the most part, little to no competition. And then in this particular city, they had a lot of people coming, audience-wise, they love sports. So reposition. Consumer takeaway, our partner, you guys are means to an end, little to no equity, but still reluctant to bet on growth. East and West, decentralized. Cultural institutions built in one particular part of the city. And then when you show up, you do pop-ups. Hey, right? We're here. And everyone that came through these interviews would cite that pop-up as the thing that they were doing to help drive growth. So no North Star, but man, they were prepared. See, we're doing this. Look. So, culture, build it from within. And what I mean by that, this is a B and C city in terms of size. And so because there was no ecosystem, creatives would come and then they'll leave, they'll go to a different place to do their art and creative, right? So it's a transactional. So when you are an artist or creator, you're the IP. You're the intellectual property. So if you can now tap in to the new majority, likely to stay versus have to leave, but you have to start when they're young. If you have a children's museum, you're still doing the programming that you did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that's a problem, right? Because there's every kid born, 90% people of color. So your audience for attendance, 10 years, 20 years, is not going to be the audience that's coming today, right? Because you're in the kids business. So, channels, go direct. Most of the agencies we were working with, they were going through other partners, but if you build an ecosystem, if you build it from within, bet on growth, you have a different value proposition. So, what we do is like do a summation of the C's, and then we say, here's an example. Within 3 years, reposition the local arts agencies from being a funding source to becoming an impact investor that is nourishing a creative and equitable ecosystem, creative class within a city through impact initiatives. So if you roll your ambition up to the future of the city that you're in, now they got a reason to invite you to those meetings other than, I need my money for the tax referendum. Because you're providing a source for the ecosystem, not just for the arts per se. I'm gonna go quickly. So what we do on the consumer side, we actually do attitudes and behavior based, but we have to bring it back to the ethnic segments because of the fact that it's so much grounded. So this is an example of a cross-cultural platform. Arts and culture moves us all forward. Now, moves us all is very different in different populations. For blacks, in this case, it's about influence, truth tellers. Hispanics, it's about representation, celebrations. So when you have that playbook, you have a cultural partner, and they're going out and they're talking about these different things, the moves us has to reflect the audience you're talking to. White consumers in this particular case was looking at arts as entertainment, and then Asian consumers in this case was about enhancing culture as a service. So that's just one example of the overall output. In terms of the outcome, we developed an impact ambition. We made business case for new business and funding. Because when you have an ecosystem, you're going out, you're investing in experiments to hopefully come to you to scale. You got a different type of ask now. You got something new to talk about. And if you have something that's innovative, people may want to give you a little bit more money, right? Because you kind of know what the outcome's going to be in a repeatable ask and a give back. And you're building a whole new creative kind of, if you look at the top 20, top 10 cities, they have a creative class. But in those cases, local arts agencies are not leading that creative class. So remember we talked about technology as the last piece? So in 2020, we're going to be introducing this. Because what we kept doing was both marketplace and workplace. How many people know what an intranet is? Raise your hand. I have to say that, right? Isn't it? I'm old, Jesus. So an intranet is what the internet is, but it's behind a company's walls, right? So what we kept seeing when we would like do this massive studies, research, and work, we turned on the inside and then the intranets would be horrific, right? So we built a technology platform that helps you sustain everything that we would have done for you. as to how do you attract and retain, but also engage the people within your organizations in a much more culturally relevant way. Because just like the marketplace services, the workplace is worse, right? 2 to 3 generations behind. So the stories that you're piping in are typically monocultural stories. So you want your people to go out and talk to different audiences, but you're not giving them the tools to do it. And it changes every single day in terms of those stories because we're in this age of acceleration, right? So quickly. And so you don't have time to respond if the tools that you have internally are not prepared. So this is what we're doing to scale everything we just talked to you about. And the takeaways. You guys know the topic. Raise your hand. Yeah, survey. Some people yawning, I get it. Yeah, I got you. You guys understand the opportunity because you're restating the problem statement, right? Much bigger, wider. Gave you an example of the approach, and it takes work. You gotta make mistakes, you're gonna fall down, but you gotta get back up because your business is dependent on it. And then you have to sustain it and scale because the people aren't changing. It's the people. Any questions? Thank you guys so much. All right. I think I said we're gonna have time for questions. There's one in the back there. I can barely see you, but is there a mic? Oh, right here. You have to come here. Could you please state your name and where you're from?
Yes. Hi, I'm Kim Hawkins. I'm from East Point, Georgia. And so my question is related to this whole notion of change management. And you're talking about arts organizations who have very limited resources to run just their daily operations, let alone what's, I think, currently considered a luxury, but obviously at the same time a necessity. So what would be your thoughts, or what are your thoughts on how arts organizations incorporate this notion of a change management competencies into their operational organization, their operational strategy?
No, that's a good question because, given the space I came from, you guys are good at raising money, right? So typically, if it's a local arts organization or agency, I'm waiting on it like 10 minutes. Well, we're in the arts business and we don't have a lot of money. Can we afford this? I said, yes, but you got to take it in steps. And what I mean by that, there are a lot of resources out there. There are books, videos, there's, educational components within the national organizations. The first thing I usually recommend, in some cases, and I'm going to call out my marketing communications associations. Associations are in the business of education. And so the first place I would start is by going to your industry association and say, hey, here's some new things that we need to be learning. Are you able to provide or facilitate? And then just like I was done, someone went to Ruby and said, hey, this needs to happen. So start with your industry association. The second thing, typically within that industry association, as a way of getting level set, online education. We have courses and classes, and ask for those facilitations within your industry association. Then marketing communications, there's a huge resistance to total market because of the $600 billion in services, right? So they gotta have a general market conference and they gotta have a multicultural conference. So not everyone is getting in the same room and getting this type of education because of the revenue model associated. So that's the first. Do your research, look at the resources, they're out there. Everything I talked about today is on our site, as well as the deck's gonna be distributed. Number two, from a funding or resource perspective, so typically we do the 6 C's in assessment in a workshop. So what the organization will then do is lay out that roadmap and then go to their board and get the funding for this investment. Because it's pretty critical that you guys become a flourishing, sustainable business as things continue to change. And then number 3, there are people that do similar work, not the same work, but in most cases you can get a pretty good relationship, or build a relationship, and do this over time versus trying to do it within one planning cycle. Good morning.
There we go. While I have the mic, it'd be nice to turn down the AC. It's freezing in here. I'm in Miami wearing a coat. Hey. To my question. Anywho, so I work for a foundation, and one of the biggest issues we see is kind of, when we talk about multiculturalism as a foundation, it's sort of like, how do you not come across as, an elite institution talking down or reaching down? So my question to you is that first I want to see if I understand what you're saying, and then I want to understand the other part of my question. And from what I understood, you're saying there are two, and there have been two approaches to marketing. One is this general audience where you find commonalities and you market to them. The second is this multicultural approach where you focus on people's highly targeted differences. And so what I understood from that is you're not necessarily looking at people in buckets of race, ethnicity, and gender, but you're looking at the values that bring those two together. So as the man in the opening video said, I have more in common as a black man than maybe with an Asian in San Francisco than I do with someone of my race, but from regionally totally different.
Yeah.
So did I understand that part right? You're saying with multiculturalism, you focus a little bit more on the values that bring people together than you would have in other traditional forms of marketing.
Yes, but I also want to hear the next part of it, and I'll tell you why afterwards.
Okay, so the next part is, if I understood that part correctly, how do we then understand the values that combine, that I guess, different communities that you wouldn't necessarily maybe make a connection to, but how do you find those threads? And then I think understanding that will help us as communications and marketing professionals figure out how exactly we do our job.
Yes, good question. So I'll answer both parts, because typically what will happen for the first time someone hears the conversation or topic, first you have to have the data and the insights of the ethnic consumers. That starts. Mm-hmm. In most cases, organizations don't have that. So in order to get to this other part, most companies want to jump to the answer. Well, in order to get to the answer, you gotta have Black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever your audience makeup is with those segments, in-house.
Got it.
Can't get away from that, all right? Mm-hmm. The second part, once you have that, because people ask me, they say, well, Jeff, how do you get all these big clients overnight? Mm-hmm. Because they all left the door open. No ethnic insights for decades, because they depended on their agencies to be that representation. So that's number 2. Number 3, once you get those insights, you glean with white or general what that commonality is, because, yes, there's this whole idea of humanization, but you still need to know, because of the census and other resources, who those humans are from a race or identity perspective. Once you have that, you glean to understand that cross-cultural piece, but also you have power now because you have the nuance. And so you actually do both. Mm-hmm. Because what happened early on in this topic within marketing communications, my multicultural agencies were like, bruh, you sold us out. The general market shops are coming for us. And then the general market shops say, total market, we love it. but they didn't have the talent to glean those insights. They had the money to get the data, but the people looking at those insights couldn't.
The analysis part.
Yeah, right, because they were what? Monocultural.
Got it.
And so when you get those pieces right, and you want to do the go-to-market piece, because of these, I don't have it with the mobile devices, you can do targeting, geo-targeting, but you're doing it in a way that doesn't seem so separate.
Got it.
Had you just done general marketing multicultural.
Great.
Right?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Any more questions? We got a few more minutes? Yeah? Yes.
Hi, my name's Jennifer. I'm from the city of Boise in Idaho.
Yes.
You talk about repositioning the local arts agency from a funding source to an impact investor.
For this particular case, yes.
All right. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you measure that?
So, and I want to make it so that it's not general for all local arts agencies because it's going to depend on where you're located. In this particular case, they had lost a huge funding source. They had tried to take it to a vote, and unfortunately, because the citizens did not know about them, they knew the work, it didn't pass, right? So either you're going to change or something's going to force you to change. And so as we went back and looked at the category piece of this, there's this idea of localism, meaning people are wanting to do things within their local. When you do like farm to table, you've heard of that within culinary. But the same thing's happening within your sector. Like people are wanting to do things on a local basis versus bringing in that talent and boom, drop them in that venue and then people come out and then that talent goes to the next city. Whereas if you're doing it from within, similar to some of the other trends, talent's gonna stay there longer. You're gonna have build what we call an ecosystem that lasts a lot longer. And that obviously changes your funding mechanism. And so in the case of getting funding to make this shift, there's this thing around impact investing that people from philanthropy and from the other sectors started doing. And so, you know, in some cases when I would visit a local arts agency, they would say, well, what do you do? Well, we give out money. I was like, okay, what do you get for it? And it would get a little quiet, right? Because they were in the arts business, addressability, measurement, reporting wasn't always there on the back end. So with impact investing, you establish what are those pillars that the city wants to achieve. Try and figure out if you play within that pillar, why is that important? Funding models have changed. Administration changes. Future city in terms of that ambition doesn't change or shouldn't. So you identify a space for you, and then for the people that you're funding should ladder down to that, and then you want to understand what you're going to get for it in return. What impact are you going to make? Where is that deficit? If it's on the east and west side. Now here's the tension. You've been probably giving money to the same people every year. You're going to have to make some different decisions as to where those resources go to make that impact, or hold the people that you've been making very well off from an operational budget standpoint, hold them accountable so that that impact supports that overall ambition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
We actually just changed our grants program criteria to you can only get a grant for 3 consecutive years, and then you have to take a break.
Yeah.
So that has, we have seen quite a change in the fabric of our applications and applicants. Seems like a good thing. I have a second question, if that's okay.
It's okay.
Right. We just went through a year-long diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility training.
Yeah.
So we're probably behind. But I feel like after hearing your talk that we're even more behind. Like we're just catching up to like
right.
a few decades ago. So what would be your recommendation? It is Idaho. Yes, I heard that.
Say that again? Okay.
It is Idaho. Okay. I heard that.
I mean, and that's that reality, right?
Yeah, we're Boise though.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Just like, just.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean.
But what would you say is your recommendation to accelerate?
Well, here's what I would say. I would need to know more, learn more.
Right.
You know, this is an innovation that we built over the course of 10 years. The practice, and I don't discourage or disparage diversity and inclusion as a practice. But what I will say that as you begin to think about the future of work, you need addressable data within the workplace. And so when you think about when you wake up in the morning, you grab that phone, right? And you figure out what's going on today. When you're in the workplace, most people don't really understand within that entire employee life cycle why people come, why people leave. So D&I and equity has all good benefits in terms of bringing people in, but then how do you keep them in? Mm-hmm. And typically, I'd say sometimes jokingly is that, the people that need the inclusion is the people that are actually there, not the people that you're bringing in. And so you got to change that culture before you really have any real success from a D&I and equity, because that ultimately, you can invite them in, pay them a lot of money, do a lot of great things, but if the people in the company is crazy, they don't leave. So that's what I would suggest is start from within versus just only about
that systemic change.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Thank you.
And I'll be around if you guys want to talk afterwards, all right? I think that's it. Amazing.